We romanticize castles, stone walls, roaring fires, noble banquets, royal chambers. But what if I told you that behind those fortified gates was a place far more dangerous than the battlefield? Inside those cold walls, invisible killers lurked. Smoke, poison, paranoia, and secrets no one dared speak aloud. Castles weren't just hard to invade, they were hard to survive. In this video, we're revealing the lethal realities of castle life that no one warned you about. And at the end, one truth so disturbing, you'll never see these walls the same way again. Breathing death, smoke, and mold. Most people think of castles as cold, but few realize they were also deadly to breathe in. Every room in a medieval castle relied on open hearths or braziers for heat. That meant constant smoke, billowing from burning wood, peat, or animal dung with little to no ventilation. Chimneys, if they existed at all, were primitive and often clogged, and when windows were covered in oiled cloth or shuttered to keep out the cold, the smoke had nowhere to go. Thick, toxic air, trapped within stone walls. Nobles and servants alike lived with constant coughing, irritated eyes, and blackened ceilings from years of soot buildup. Respiratory infections were common. Some children never grew strong lungs. Elders were slowly suffocated across winters that never truly ended indoors. But fire wasn't the only thing poisoning the air. Castles were built from limestone and granite, materials that trapped moisture. Cold seeped in from the ground, and without proper insulation, walls remained damp year-round. This created the perfect breeding ground for black mold, which spread in corners, under rugs, behind tapestries, and within that grand-looking stonework. People didn't know what mold was, but they felt its effects. Chronic headaches, fever, joint pain, fatigue, and mysterious illnesses that lingered for months. Many medieval deaths recorded as consumption or wasting sickness may have been caused in part by long-term exposure to spores and poor air quality. Even nobility, surrounded by wealth and servants, couldn't escape the damp breath of the castle itself. And unlike a sword, mold didn't strike fast. It killed slowly, quietly, every breath a little worse than the last. Rotten food, poisoned plates. In a medieval castle, food could be a luxury, or a slow death on a silver plate. While nobles dined on roasted meats and rich stews, what they didn't know was that much of what they consumed was already spoiled, or worse, laced with silent poisons. There were no refrigerators, no germ theory, and only the most basic understanding of food preservation. Meat left too long would be rubbed with salt or spices to mask the smell. Fish could arrive already rotting from distant rivers. Cheese was aged, but not always intentionally. And bread, if not eaten quickly, developed mold that could trigger nausea, hallucinations, or worse. The kitchens were massive, but hygiene was nearly non-existent. Dozens of workers prepared meals side by side with dogs, livestock, and vermin. Leftover scraps were rarely cleared properly. Rats ran freely beneath floorboards, and water used for cooking was often drawn from wells already contaminated by waste runoff. But there was a more deliberate danger too. Political enemies, sometimes even members of the same family, knew that poisoning was far cleaner than a blade. With no forensics, no tests, and no knowledge of bacteria, a sudden illness could easily be blamed on bad air or divine punishment. Servants could be bribed, cupbearers could be silenced, a bit of deadly nightshade in wine, or just an overripe fruit hiding a moldy core. Nobles were so paranoid that they began employing food tasters, servants who would take the first bite knowing that any hesitation might cost their lives. In castles where power changed hands through inheritance or betrayal, dining could be the most dangerous ritual of all. Because what looked like a feast might have been an execution. Fire in the night. Castles were built of stone, but inside those walls, everything else was ready to burn. At first glance, a medieval castle looks indestructible, cold, solid, eternal. But step inside and you'd find wood everywhere. Floors, staircases, rafters, beds, tapestries, even the beams that held ceilings together. Add in hay-stuffed mattresses, dry rushes on the floor, and constant use of open flames, and the stage was set for disaster. There were no chimneys in early castles, just hearths in the center of rooms with smoke rising towards small holes in the ceiling. Fireplaces were rarely contained. Candles burned day and night, and torches lined the walls like ticking time bombs. At night, the risk grew worse. Servants moved through the dark with wax candles or oil lamps. A strong gust of wind through a loose shutter, a forgotten ember left glowing, or a single candle tipping onto cloth. And the entire castle could ignite before anyone noticed. Once fire took hold, it moved fast. Stone didn't burn, but everything else did. And few walls inside a castle were designed to slow the flames. Thick smoke flooded the halls. Panic spread. People stumbled through the dark, choking, screaming, trying to find staircases that had already collapsed. There were no alarms, no escape routes, no fire plan, and water was stored in barrels, heavy, limited, and useless once the flames reached the ceiling. Entire wings of castles were lost in a single night. In 1214, a fire at Windsor Castle tore through the upper chambers while the royal court slept. Furniture, records, and lives were lost before the sun rose. And that was one of the lucky ones, because the castle itself still stood. In others, nobles died in their beds, servants leapt from towers, and sometimes no one survived to write it down. Because in a world without electricity, without fire codes or escape ladders, one spark was all it took. Collapsing ceilings and cracked towers. A castle might have looked unshakable from the outside, but inside, many were one bad season away from collapse. Castles were built fast, expanded over decades, and rarely maintained with care. Rain seeped through weakened rooftops, frost cracked the mortar between stones, wooden beams warped over time, and when repairs were delayed, often due to war or lack of funds, the entire structure became a silent threat to everyone living within. Towers that had stood for centuries could shift after a long winter. Roofs weighed down by snow or water would suddenly cave in. Servants, guards, and even noble children were sometimes crushed beneath collapsed ceilings or stairwells, killed not by enemies, but by the very walls meant to protect them. In some castles, rooms were simply closed off for safety, left to rot. Others continued to be used, even as cracks spread through the stonework and support beams groaned under pressure. The danger was known, but ignored. These weren't rare events. Chroniclers from the time described incidents where halls gave way mid-feast, or staircases collapsed under marching soldiers. One poorly placed stone or overlooked fracture could trigger a disaster no one could escape from. Living in a castle didn't just mean watching the horizon for invaders. It meant looking up and hoping the ceiling would hold. Fleas, rats, and plague in the walls. Castles promised protection from war, but they offered no protection from what lived inside their own walls. Every medieval castle was home to a hidden population, one that multiplied in the dark, behind the stone, and beneath the rush-covered floors. Rats scurried through granaries and kitchens, chewing into sacks of grain and contaminating food before it ever reached the table. Mice built nests in beds and storage rooms. Lice infested every layer of clothing. Fleas thrived in bedding that was rarely washed, and hay-filled mattresses that were only replaced a few times a year, if ever. In the warmer months, it was even worse. Waste from chamber pots spilled into courtyards and moats, creating breeding grounds for flies and vermin. Cats were kept to control the rats, but even they couldn't keep up. Some castles had dozens of cats roaming the halls, and the problem still persisted. These infestations weren't just disgusting, they were deadly. By the 14th century, the Black Death swept through Europe, and castles, despite their isolation, were no exception. Servants, soldiers, and nobles alike brought fleas inside unknowingly. The same tunnels used to move supplies became highways for disease. Once a single infected person entered the grounds, the tightly packed population and poor hygiene turned castles into plague incubators. But even outside major outbreaks, the health toll was constant. Rat-borne illnesses like leptospirosis and salmonella infected food and water. Lice carried trench fever, a disease that caused high fevers and rashes, and fungal spores from animal droppings and rotting grain lingered in the air, causing chronic respiratory infections. Yet nobles continued to believe that disease came from bad air or divine punishment. They burned herbs, they carried sweet-smelling pomanders, but they did not clean. The rats remained, the bedding stayed, and the illness returned again and again. Some castles tried to quarantine the sick. A few even built separate pest houses within their grounds, small stone huts where infected servants were locked away. But many were simply abandoned to die in their beds, with no treatment and no burial, left behind in closed rooms that no one dared to enter again. By the end of the Middle Ages, castle walls had witnessed more deaths from infection than from arrows or swords. And worst of all, those who lived there thought it was normal. Death from within, betrayals, and quiet revenge. Not every threat in a medieval castle wore armor or came through the gate. Sometimes the most dangerous people lived just down the hall. Castles weren't just military strongholds. They were political pressure cookers. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of people lived together inside the same walls. Nobles, heirs, rivals, servants, guards, and spies. Power changed hands through inheritance, marriage, or manipulation, and ambition rarely waited patiently. A whispered accusation could lead to imprisonment. A forged letter could cost someone their title or their life. And when the stakes were high, murder wasn't just possible, it was practical. Some attacks were dramatic, poisoned goblets, assassins hiding in the shadows, but most were quiet. A noble might never wake up after a banquet. A servant might slip on stairs no one bothered to repair. A knight might fall ill after a shared meal with no way to prove how or why. Jealous siblings, unhappy marriages, trusted advisors with secret loyalties. Everyone had a reason to play a longer game. But violence didn't only come from the nobility. Servants worked exhausting, dangerous hours for little reward. One wrong move could get them beaten or banished. Some snapped. There are records of castle staff poisoning food, setting fires, or attacking their masters during the night. Sometimes out of revenge, sometimes just out of desperation. This is why many nobles didn't sleep in grand halls or central chambers. They chose remote rooms, high towers, or behind secret doors. Anything to stay one step ahead of betrayal. Some castles even included listening holes in the walls designed for guards to eavesdrop on conversations. It wasn't about security from invaders. It was about security from each other. Because in a place where power meant everything, no one was ever safe. Not in public, and never in private. Mental collapse behind stone walls. Castles didn't just wear down the body. They wore down the mind. To outsiders, life inside a fortress seemed privileged, safe from the chaos of the outside world. But isolation came at a cost. Cold stone walls, narrow windows, dim candlelight, and months of confinement during winter or siege created a setting where silence echoed louder than voices. Many nobles spent long stretches of their lives in near solitude. Young brides were sent to foreign castles, surrounded by unfamiliar languages and strangers. Widows were locked away in remote towers. Political prisoners, including members of royal families, could spend years in elegant cages, rooms that looked regal but felt like tombs. Even those in power weren't immune. Paranoia was common. Every court was filled with rumors, shifting alliances, and silent observers. Nobles slept in different chambers each night. Guards were rotated constantly. Some rulers trusted no one, not even their own family. Over time, the mental strain left visible cracks. Medieval chronicles describe nobles who became unbalanced and melancholic or lost to madness. King Charles VI of France famously believed he was made of glass and refused to be touched. Others simply stopped speaking altogether, withdrawn into the silence of their own mind. And for the lower ranks, things weren't better. Servants lived with constant fear of punishment, injury, or abandonment. Long hours, freezing quarters, and the trauma of witnessing death during sieges broke people slowly. There were no words like anxiety or depression, only shame, silence, or superstition. Today, we might call it isolation fatigue. Back then, it was simply a part of castle life. Because when the doors closed and the fires dimmed, many were left alone with nothing but the cold and their thoughts. The illusion of safety. To the people outside, a castle meant protection. Thick stone walls, towers that touched the sky, guards at every gate. From a distance, it looked like nothing could touch those inside. But that was the illusion. castles were designed to delay danger, not eliminate it. They could keep out invaders for a time, but eventually most fell, sometimes to siege engines, sometimes to starvation, and just as often to betrayal from within. During a siege, food supplies ran out within weeks, wells ran dry, fires couldn't be lit without giving away your position. Disease spread faster behind sealed gates than on an open battlefield. Rats, fleas, and mold took over long before the enemy broke through the walls. Even in times of peace, the risks never stopped. Fires destroyed wings of fortresses overnight. Ceilings collapsed. Children drowned in poorly maintained wells. Poison, punishment, and political plots claimed lives before swords ever did. And still, the castle was seen as a haven. People fled to it in times of danger, thinking stone walls guaranteed safety. But for many who lived inside, especially the servants, the sick, the powerless, those same walls became a cage, a fortress that trapped them with the very dangers they were trying to escape. Some castles stood for centuries, but most fell, not from force, not from fire, but from the slow, creeping weight of time, neglect, and the false belief that stone could protect them from everything. Because in the Middle Ages, even the safest place was never truly safe. Final reflection. A fortress or a trap? Living in a medieval castle wasn't the fantasy many imagine. Behind the stone walls were dangers no one warned you about, hidden threats that didn't wear armor or carry swords, fire, disease, betrayal, mental collapse. Not always sudden, but always waiting. For nobles, servants, and even royalty, survival depended on more than walls or titles. It depended on luck, caution, and knowing where not to step, or who not to trust. So next time you see a grand castle, ask yourself, would you really want to live there?